Have you ever met people that are always doing new, extraordinary things in a way that inspires you? We're going to hear from another one today. Ironically, today's guest and I have nearly identical backgrounds across big parts of our career journey, which you'll hear about today. On one path, you have me. I took one job and have been here almost 30 years. On the other path, you have today's guest, who took all of those same academic and professional experiences, but has had several really neat chapters in his career. Today, we're going to talk about his current chapter. Enjoy! Mark, I always start these episodes by asking our guests to introduce themselves with the goal of giving people a sense of who they're listening to. So would you take a minute and do that for us real quick?
Yeah, of course, Keith. Very happy to do it. So, first of all, lovely to see you and great to spend a little bit of time chatting today. My name is Marc Farrell. I am the founder and CEO of 10 to 1 Rum. Whenever I kind of begin with my own personal background, I always start with explaining the accent that folks will be hearing today. So, born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago, very proud son of the soil. I left Trinidad as a 16-year-old, came to MIT for college, first stop on what has been a long and winding road since then, studied chemical engineering. After that, spent some time in the UK over at Cambridge, did a master's in public policy. Really a little bit of an extra year's boondoggle. I had an offer at being in company, as you know, had a chance to defer for a little bit, go play basketball for a year, and then come back and start my career. So moved back to Boston in 2004, had my first job out of college at Bain. An incredible foundational job to have, right? Where you think about the people that you meet and the skills that you're able to acquire. It's a core toolkit, a core skill set that I apply quite liberally even today, 20 years on. After that, did a little stint in private equity over with Fidelity in the UK. That was a time when I think a lot of folks were looking at sort of that consulting to private equity segue as a very natural one to make.
Right.
Was never sure that I was going to be a full-fledged private equity guy. It didn't really seem like it was my thing, but a chance to again go cut your teeth and develop some learning there. Moved back to the US in 2008. Went to Harvard for business school. I always kind of call out the years then because, again, that's against the backdrop of the global financial crisis, world falling apart a little bit. I think it kind of insulated some folks who have business school from some of that, but also created a little bit of a moment of reckoning, right? When people begin to ask this question of what sort of role do you want to play in what the future state of the world might look like.
Right.
And if you actually look at that cohort coming out of HBS, tons of entrepreneurs, myself included, who decided that they wanted to kind of go write their own script and author a bit of their own path. So I left HBS in 2010, moved to New York, had my first business in the sports and media space. I actually parlayed that into an e-commerce opportunity, working with a number of professional athletes, probably the most famous of which was Marshawn Lynch, creating his Beast Mode line of apparel back in 2014. And as I was at a little bit of a crossroads with that business, ended up meeting Howard Schultz, fairly serendipitously, 2015. Amazing guy, amazing entrepreneur, still a mentor of mine. You kind of meet some of these folks on your journey.
Hang on one second for me, Mark.
Sure.
Can you say who Howard Schultz is? Because you made it sound like you just bumped into dude at the park.
Yeah, sorry. And I kind of did just bump into him at the park. But Howard Schultz, I think an American entrepreneurial icon, obviously, the founder and CEO of Starbucks. What I was going to say was that you have these moments where you meet certain folks, right? This is a guy who I met who was on the cover of Forbes and Fortune and all these magazines, right? But in that moment, you're meeting him, and two things impressed me about Howard from the jump. One is he talked like an entrepreneur, sounded like a guy with 30 coffee shops, not 30,000, right?
Right.
And two, had this incredible sense of passion and purpose around him.
Mm-hmm.
You and I could be having a conversation, game recognize game. I can recognize your sense of purpose. It doesn't have to be the same as mine, but there's something I can see in that, and that sense of purpose really resonates. I think there's a little bit of that at play when I first met Howard a number of years ago. And so with kind of those two things struck upon me, not to mention, of course, his incredibly, again, sort of illustrious background as the modern sort of founder and creator of all things around Starbucks in the third place. He invited me to come out to Seattle and spend some time with the team out there. For whatever reason, he was a little bit fascinated with my entrepreneurial journey up until that point. And I was somehow convinced, still don't know how it happened, but I was somehow convinced to leave my dope bachelor life in New York, move out to Seattle, and join the executive team out there. So I joined the executive team at Starbucks in 2016. I ran e-commerce globally for Starbucks for a few years. In addition to that, actually, sort of also ran a portion of the retail business, what we would call the retail lobby. So if you walk into a Starbucks store, P&L, that's front of house, packaged coffee, packaged food, merchandise. I ran that business for the
Wow.
US. Incredible experience. If Bain was where I kind of cut my teeth, Starbucks in some ways felt a little bit more like a finishing school. What does a Fortune 500 Seattle-based coffee company have to do with where I am today? The founder of a New York-based startup rum company full of Caribbean heritage. Maybe not that much on the face of it, but I think there's so much that comes from sitting and seeing an entrepreneur like that up close, understanding what it looks like to build a brand with a very clear sense of purpose, with a very clear sense of what you will and won't do. And then many of those lessons that I was able to kind of pull and take with me as I made the transition into, I guess, my latest and greatest adventure, which is as founder and CEO of 10 to 1 Rum.
We're going to get into 10 to 1 in a few minutes, but before I do that, how would you say we know each other? We could have met at any one of several ways over the years when I look back and say, man, how did I not know this guy before this? But from your perspective, how would you say we knew each other?
Yeah, I mean, listen, if you're just gonna take a quick glance at the resume, you'd say that I'm a Keith Bevan's protege. You know what I mean? hitting all the spots. The guy does the MIT Bain HBS circuit. I gotta go do it too. So yeah, there are a few different stops along the way. Not to mention a number of friends in common, obviously, that
Yep.
could have allowed
Yep.
us to cross paths. My earliest recollections of meeting you, Keith, would have been in those early sort of cell days at Bain.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that got me excited about, a number of things that got me excited about Bain. I still bleed Bain red today, even though I left that company 17 years ago, right? So many of my best friends, best memories, etc., are still from Bain. But one of the things that really kind of drew me in at the time was the whole Babs. For those listening, Babs was a Blacks at Bain ecosystem. The Keith and the folks like Madupe Akinola was another amazing mentor. She interviewed me, hired me at Bain back in the day. Were responsible for. I think, whenever you're coming into an environment like Bain, and everybody has a little bit of imposter syndrome at various points in their career, right?
Mm-hmm.
You sort
Mm-hmm.
of look to muses or to mentors who maybe
Right.
have walked those halls before you and I think found a way to be successful. And Keith Bevans, I'll refer to him in the third person here, was certainly one of those folks that I think myself and many other first year ACs look up to.
Man, that is wild. And I remember meeting you probably because there weren't that many Black associate consultants coming in, and definitely not a lot from MIT. And so I was like,
Exactly.
who's this cat? And why haven't I met him during recruiting at all? And since then, I think we've stayed in touch. I've seen you come back as a keynote speaker at some of our events inside Bain, sharing your journey alongside some of your peers. And it's been really awesome to hear a lot about your journey. It's really inspiring for me and a lot of other people. And so I want to thank you for coming on today to talk a little bit about what you've been up to and give people a sense of why I've been so inspired by your journey over the last 15 and 20 years.
Yeah, appreciate it. Absolutely. Excited to dive in.
Mark, as we get into this, I want to talk about your first experience with Caribbean spirits. And I want to acknowledge up front, I'm not trying to get you in trouble with your parents about when you started drinking, but when did you recognize or come of age and realize like spirits in Caribbean culture are different and they're special?
Yeah, well, first of all, you can't get me into any more trouble than I've already gotten into. My one of the first press pieces that came out around 10 to 1 described me as a lifelong rum drinker, a lifelong fan of rum. And my mom was like, why do you have these people figure that like you've been drinking rum your whole life? I said, Mom, they don't mean like my whole life, just my adult life, just to be super clear. So we will preach a responsible practicing of the art there for sure. But as you already foreshadowed a little bit, I tell people that the origin story of 10 to 1 and certainly the rum that we brought to life, right, is kind of deeply rooted in the heritage and the culture and the way of being, the way of life that is Caribbean culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think as I look back to my formative years, whether it was just kind of seeing my uncles, my dad, their friends kind of gathering, you're on the streets of Trinidad Carnival, you think about all of these moments of celebration that are sort of core to Trinidadian culture and certainly core to the Caribbean culture, and realize how much rum has played a central role
Mm-hmm.
across all of those, right? And so I think there's a natural curiosity that's kind of just woven into that fabric for many of us at a fairly early age. And then at some point along the journey, as a responsible adult, right, you got a chance to try the spirit for the first time, and you pick up sort of your favorite cocktails along the way. And some of us, I think, maybe take that a step further into a level of curiosity around the origin of the spirit
Mm-hmm.
and the
Mm-hmm.
art of the craft and ways in which some of that can be manifested and brought to life. Some folks who end up that curious, maybe where they land is they become rum collectors or they're rum connoisseurs of a
Right.
sort, not necessarily starting a rum brand per se, but I think it's been that arc that I've been walking for a number of years, but all inspired by that Trinidadian, that Caribbean heritage.
So now, recognizing that responsible drinking age might vary depending on where you are in the world, it does sound like you equated rum with good times and other things that were happening. You mentioned Carnival in there. I imagine it's a part of family celebrations. Is that one role that rum plays in the culture?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time, the last 5 years thinking about how to most effectively carry water for this culture that I feel so strongly about and feel so proud of, right? And when asked to articulate sort of what is Caribbean culture, what does it mean, what does it represent? Part of my frustration with rum historically, and I'll get back to your question, I promise, is that I think that it's attached to a very naive, one-dimensional view, not just of the spirit rum, but actually of the culture that surrounds it as well. Caribbean culture is not about beaches and palm trees. I think it's actually far richer and far more meaningful than that. I think it's the joie de vivre, it's the spontaneity, it's the come as you are nature, it's the serendipity. I think you every time you hear somebody tell a story about that time they were in the Caribbean or someone who they met from the Caribbean, there's always a sense that they were willing to kind of say yes to something unexpected. They were willing to veer off the beaten path. Maybe
Right,
you
right.
ended up chilling with some people till 2 a.m. We call it liming. You ended up liming with some people till 2 a.m. who you never met before in your life. And maybe you'll never even see them again. But there's something about that experience just leaves you so much richer for it, right? And there's a
Hmm.
little bit of kind of magic that comes from that. And so when I talk about, not to come back to your question, that spirit of the Caribbean, yes, it's moments of celebration, and yes, it's moments of joy. But I think it's a slightly more expanded view of that. When I talk about this idea of the spirit of the Caribbean, it's some of that joie de vivre and that magic and that spontaneity, that additive nature, that stronger together element that I'm really trying to represent. And I think if you look at rum as sort of the catalyst, as I said, for many of those moments, then all of a sudden it starts to kind of open your mind to all the possibilities that are attached to certainly a brand like 10 to 1.
So I'll have to add the word liming to my vocabulary, which it sounds like has no rules or time or place, but it does sound like you can't do it alone. And so you have to be
Uh,
around other people.
that's literally it. And I think in so many ways, again, emblematic of that culture, right? Like no structure, no strictures, right? You come and do it as you will. The only rule is you cannot lime by yourself, right? You're liming with others. It is inherently a social activity, right? About the sense of community that again is always a through line in all things Caribbean to me.
So now that's your first exposure and the roots of Caribbean spirits in your life. But when did you decide that this was a place where you're going to put all of your training, all of your life experiences, your network, your energy, and found a company in this space?
Yeah, it's a good question. Time will tell. We hope that's been a good decision, right? But I mentioned that sort of Starbucks experience kind of at the top when I was giving my little intro, and yeah, it's funny how two experiences that on the surface might seem diametrically opposed to each other can actually, in many ways, be a catalyst for each other or inspire each other, right? And I think Starbucks was very much that. From my time doing the corporate entrepreneurship type of a role at Starbucks, about 18 months into my tenure, this little itch started to come back, this entrepreneurial
Mm-hmm.
itch. What would it look like to get back out there into the world and create a business through the lens of who I am, where I'm from, the things that I care about, right? And I think the more that I thought about that, it became clearer and clearer that that needed to be run. When you dream up an entrepreneurial endeavor, I think there's lots of ways you can go about that, right? Like you might just see an opportunity out there in the
Right.
wild. You might think sometimes an opportunity to make a quick buck over in that little corner of the universe. One of the things that I kind of got from that Starbucks experience was how fundamental I think it was to have something that really sort of tied to your own sense of passion and purpose, right? And so again, like this is not just I just see something over there that I could go do. It just happens to be rum. Let me go pick it up tomorrow. No, this is like tell a story of your culture, carry water for it as authentically as you can. And hopefully, if you do that well, then all the other pieces around it will kind of flow quite naturally, right? And so that's the piece. That's the through line between sort of the experience and the inspo from a place like Starbucks that then brings you to something like 10 to 1, where you say to yourself, I talk to young entrepreneurs sometimes and I say, years ago, I was at a seminar and somebody was some VC guy, blowing a lot of hot air, but was talking about finding something you could be the best in the world at. And I said, I heard that at the time, but in my first entrepreneurial go around, I actually misinterpreted the advice. I actually thought of it in actually too broad of a fashion. Like, can you be the best in the world at sports startups, right? That's a very
Right.
hard thing to
Right.
do. If I think about 10 to 1, I'm doing something that I can be the best in the world at. And it's not because no one else can make incredible rum. There's lots of excellent rums that are out there. I think the nuance is, again, you're telling a story. You have a particular way into the category that is uniquely yours, right? I'm telling a story that's tied to sort of me and rooted in that heritage and that perspective, and that you can be the best in the world at. I think if you find that thing as an entrepreneur, it then gives you a little bit of a leg up in what's going to be a difficult journey regardless, gives you a chance to be successful.
Mark, I want to pick up the thread with some of the things that you mentioned before the break and talk about some of the things that make Caribbean Spirit special for you, because I know it's more than just a drink. What is it about what you're doing that's different? And again, you started to get into that, but I want to pull the thread a little bit more.
Yeah, so Keith, for us, one of the things that's really unique about the 10 to 1 story is this is not a Trinidadian rum or a Jamaican rum or a Barbadian rum, right? We create these exceptional Pan Caribbean blends, right? Our perspective early on was this idea of really the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. You could bring different distillation methods, different provenance, different terroir to life to create something very unique, very nuanced, very exceptional in its own right. It's funny, I always tell people there's a little bit of a key that unlocks the secret to this brand. And that key is in understanding the origins of the name. So the name 10 to 1, inspired by the original Caribbean Federation, which consisted of 10 countries, the idea of 10 becoming one, right? And Trinidad's prime minister at the time famously saying, 1 from 10 leaves 0. Brilliant guy, good at math. But if you remove 1 from the collective, the whole thing falls apart. So the brand is based on this idea of community, strength in numbers, the idea that we're all stronger together than we are apart. I sort of mentioned that there because, again, you can see that brought to life in the articulation of the liquid, what we're doing with these kind of exceptional Pan-Caribbean blends. But it's also true in the way that the brand story is brought to life. I think that's really kind of how we think about, again, this expression of Caribbean culture. These different cultures, communities, perspectives that all have a seat at the table. They come together as an amalgam to create something better than any one of them could have been on their own. I think it's a little bit of the beauty of that story that we bring to life through 10 to 1 as well.
And so do you feel like you're representing your home country or you're representing all 10 countries or the Caribbean as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think both, but certainly the Caribbean. 10 to 1's a Caribbean rum. It's a Pan Caribbean story. I think in many ways it's meant to be an expression or a love letter to Caribbean culture. I always tell people that I don't pretend to be some single source of truth with Caribbean culture is concerned. I'm not the arbiter of Caribbean culture. You might be from Barbados or Jamaica and have a different POV or perspective that I have, and that's totally fine. And we're super respectful of that. I'm just trying to tell the story through the lens that I've seen, what I've come to know, what I've come to appreciate, And so, yes, it is very much a Caribbean story that's being put out here in the wider world. I said to somebody the other day, and I'll reference Starbucks one more time and then maybe I'll stop. But I always tell people that with Starbucks, people would think that it was a story of coffee, but in reality, Howard would say it's actually the story of the third place. You had your home, you had work, you had the third place where you could sort of gather, share a cup of coffee, that sense of community, right? That's really what the business is about. I think with 10 to 1, you can actually apply a similar macro view to it where what am I trying to do? I'm trying to take something that was born out of the soil where I'm from, right? I'm trying to elevate it, celebrate it, put it on a global stage. And actually, whether that happens to be rum or hibiscus tea or something of the sort, there's lots of things under that umbrella that really speak to the broader mission, the broader inspiration for creating 10 to 1. So for me, this has always been a very personal journey. The rum, of course, is central to it, but really the objective is much bigger than that.
Mark, for a drink that's so culturally relevant to you, I do feel like you're breaking down some of the things people assume to be true about rum. And I want to get into that a little bit because when we were preparing for this, that was also something that made this mission that you're on special to you. So where should we start?
Yeah, I think a good place to start is a little bit of where rum has been. I kind of mentioned from my own background, born and raised in Trinidad. I've spent, 25 years living abroad, between the US and the UK. If you want to kind of get into my own origin story around 10 to 1, it would really kind of start like this. It would say, young guy, or sort of young guy now from Trinidad, sees that many other spirits are rising to prominence, right? As this kind of wave of premiumization takes root. You've seen it with tequila in the last decade plus. You've seen it with
Vodka.
American whiskey. You saw it with vodka before that, exactly right. And for some reason, rum just hasn't been invited to that party, right? It
Hmm.
still gets thought of as a very kind of a lower end spirit confined to a fairly narrow set of occasions, right? Like the spring break trips and the
Right.
the, the beachy pina coladas
Right.
and has a fairly one-dimensional story of the Caribbean attached to it. And really sort of when you think about sort of raising the profile, challenging expectations, as we would call it, it's all about, I think, shifting that perception, really reframing it, right? I think like showing people that rum can be a very elevated liquid
Right.
in its own right. The level of craft and care that goes into producing any amazing rum. The fact that rums can age 2 to 3 times faster without heat and humidity in the Caribbean than a Scotch whiskey can. So if you're drinking an 8-year-old rum versus a 15-year-old Scotch whiskey, you're actually going to find, I think, more nuance and complexity in that 8-year-old rum than you often will in some of those older whiskeys. And so I think exposing brick, as I like to call it, right, sort of metaphorically, exposing brick and showing people sort of how fantastic that liquid can be. And then, of course, as I keep on coming back to, making sure you can take them into less about a view of what's right and what's wrong about Caribbean culture, but adding some more dimension, some more depth, some more breadth to that story. I think is a big part of what we've done to really try to shift some of those perceptions.
So maybe showing some of my ignorance a little bit, but you put rum alongside whiskey or vodka and some of the other spirits. How much of the status, the historical status of rum has to do with its origin story? I've been to some of the distilleries in Jamaica and in Puerto Rico, but when we were in St. Kitts, we also visited several sugar plantations.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a history of rum being attached to those plantations and the slave labor that harvested the sugar cane to
Mm-hmm.
make the rum. And is the legacy of that maybe part of the reason why rum hasn't elevated alongside some of its non-Caribbean, non-black cousins on the spirit side?
Yeah, I think there's a host of different reasons for it. To be honest, I mean, look, if you let's go back to that same history. I always tell people that actually long before there were rum brands, rum was being created and produced for export. So
Right.
you have these plantations, sugar refining, rum distilling, and then being shipped off to the US and on to Europe, right? And so you have literally casks, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands leaving the shores of the Caribbean to be enjoyed elsewhere. I think with that sort of chain in mind, that sort of workflow in mind, right? Like the ability to kind of establish maybe some of that earlier appreciation for singular brands, singular artisans. Look at the heritage of champagne as a counter to that, where if you look at an old manifest from 100 years ago, you'll see Dom Perignon and Veuve Clicquot and Louis Ritter and all these guys that are in there, right? These are houses that have hundreds of years of heritage and
Right.
history attached to them. And rum, in many ways, has not had that. I think the brands in rum have been much sort of later breaking on the global stage. On top of which, there's some other things that are kind of endemic to rum that I think have made it problematic. So, for a separate podcast, we can talk about some of the taxes and tax incentives that places like Puerto Rico and St. Croix avail themselves of,
Mm-hmm.
which really kind of incentivize some of the larger producers to put out as much volume as possible, irrespective of the price point that's attached to it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's an incentive problem here, which kind of leads you down the path of lower end, higher volume quantities versus maybe sort of lower volume, higher price point sort of offerings as well. And look, I think last but not least, it comes down to again the storytelling, the lore that surrounds the category. I think that like every category is able to transcend into something that feels more premium, certainly has a certain lore, a certain covetability, a certain aspirational nature that's attached to it. I think rum historically has kind of just been mired in this kind of old colonial or this kind of party spring break lane, and we got to get it to break free from that in order to give it a chance to have a seat at that same table.
Mark, what's it like when you go someplace and see your product in the world? One of the cool things I remember when I was a consultant and doing client work was I would go to the store and see things that I worked on, and seeing my clients' products in the world was just really cool. But you're actually seeing your own products in the world. I have to believe that's a special part of what you're doing when you go to a bar, you go to a restaurant and just see like your stuff on the menu and people are like, are you that guy? And you're like, yeah, that's me.
Yeah, there's honestly there's nothing more gratifying than that. And it doesn't get that much. It's just as exciting 5 years later as it was back in 2019 when we started. Obviously in those days it was like delivering your first. I hand delivered my first cases of 10-1. Right, I saw that bottle go up on the bar at Coast in New York for the very first time. I'll never forget walking into a bar in the East Village and another dude just walked up alongside me and he ordered 10-1. I was like, what? You're ordering 10-1? Like, how do you even know about this brand? Right? Oh, yeah, I know it. I love it. Like, I've heard the founder story, all of that stuff. And that's like so energizing.
That's
Look, I mean,
cool.
to me, one of the joys of being a founder in the consumer space, anything consumer, you create a tangible product, put in
Right.
people's hands, in their glasses.
Right.
You give them a chance to share it. Again, the moorings of rum and Caribbean culture, celebration, community, creativity, that sense of the collective. Anytime I can be a part of that experience, I'm excited about it. So you see it on the cocktail menu, you see folks drinking and trying it. I just got back from Barbados a couple of hours ago, as I mentioned, and I was at a hotel there. A lady came running across the lobby to stop me and say, she's like, "Hey, you're Mark from 10-1, right?" And she took a moment to say that she loved the rum, but she also loved the story and the purpose and the mission around it. And it's really cool when you put something out there in the world that means something to people. And it certainly puts a little bit more fuel in your own tanker to kind of keep charging forward and try to deliver something that they'll continue to be proud of and, in fact, can raise the bar for the category. So, yes, it's always been a real point of pride.
And of course, founding something in 2019 before everybody got locked up from going to some of the social gatherings that might have fueled the growth. Are you seeing that response and that receptiveness to the message and the story and the mission that you're on in the marketplace?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think yeah, the last 5 years have come with a number of twists and turns. I mean, first of all, anything consumer is hard. Anything bev alc is hard. I think everything within rum within bev alc within consumer is maybe harder. You throw on top of that sort of a global pandemic and the threats of looming recession and inflationary pressures and the big guys with the inventory challenges. And there's been no shortage of, you could write 3 different tomes, right, over the course of the last 5 years. But I think when you kind of strip all of that away and just ask yourself, or you kind of try to take stock of the progress you've been able to make, the answer is yeah. I think there's a lot about this story that really resonates. I think this idea of what is 10-1 trying to do? I think we're trying to be a spark. We're trying to inspire what I would call creative and cultural progress by sharing the spirit of the Caribbean with the world. And the spirit of the Caribbean is the spirit rum. It's also the spirit, right, that I sort
Yep.
of mentioned at the top here as well. Every time people have a chance to see that, to feel that, you come to a 10-1 event, taste that in the product. There's something about that story that continues to kind of pull them in. And so, yes, I mean, look, do I wish that I had some of the same tailwinds that tequila as a category has? Yeah, probably every day, to be honest. I'll have a few less gray hairs at this point if that were the case. But you kind of wait for the winds or the tides to start shifting in your direction, and until then, you keep pushing forward as any good entrepreneur will, leading as authentically as you possibly can, roll up your sleeves, share the story. I think you see the fruits of that labor that end up being born as a result.
So I know the ride is fun, but it certainly requires a grind. And I want to wrap this up by giving you a chance to let people know how they can find 10-1 rum. If people listen to this or are inspired by the story and want to taste or engage with the product, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody taking a listen, go out there and try some 10-1 ASAP, please. We'd appreciate the love for sure. Number of ways to do it. So we're live today in the US in about 24 states. New York, Illinois, California, Florida, Texas, Georgia, the list, DC, the list goes on. Those are kind of our top 7. So certainly ask it at any bar or restaurant near you. A number of the larger retailers around the country, Total Wine, Specs in Texas, Binny's in Chicago, all carry the product. And if you can't find it at any one of those spots, you can certainly find it online. Just go to 10to1rum.com. We ship to 42, 43 of the states in the US today. We're happy to deliver a couple of bottles to your door. So whether it's at the liquor store, at a ton of iconic bars and restaurants around the country, or online, lots of avenues for you to give 10-1 a shot.
And Mark, they can also follow you on Instagram, and I believe it's 10-1 with everything spelled out, TENTOONE.
RUM, 10-1 rum, all spelled out. Yep. You can find us there as well.
Marc, thanks so much for coming on today. It was great to hear your story. I really enjoy talking with entrepreneurs because the passion that they have for what they're doing goes beyond a product and speaks to the mission. So thank you for sharing some of that with us today.
Yeah, very much a pleasure, Keith. Lovely to see you, man. We'll chat soon.
Thanks for listening to this episode of My Home is Special. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes automatically. You can go to myhomeisspecial.com to see the full project and sign up for email updates. Be sure to follow KBevPhoto on Instagram or go to kbevphoto.com to see what I'm snapping these days. There's a lot on both to explore. For now, this is Keith, aka KBev, signing off. Peace.